I often mention in my videos how so often we start with an idea that drawing is about using lines to outline shapes, but that this really derives from very simple drawings that we see and create as children that actually owe a lot to a cartoon genre style of drawing. And that a better way to think is of using marks to create our drawings. Lines, of course, are some of the marks we can use, but it opens up our thinking to create effect when we think marks through a more sophisticated use of ink on the paper. So, whereas we have a line here to define the shape of this wall, a series of marks that are less regular creates more realistically the slightly irregular shape of the rough stones on that edge. Instead of making it look like a very smooth, sharp edge, we've created more the effect of this rough stonework, and this ties in with this. We've done the same thing here and down here. We've encircled the stump with an even line, which does reflect what we see of this part of the stump in our reference. But by controlling the mark we use, not having an even line, but by having a series of shorter lines that we stop and start, that we even leave slight gaps in, and we put more weight, we put more heaviness of ink in certain sections, and in other sections we're so light that the line almost disappears to reflect the fact of the sun striking the edge or not striking the edge in different ways, and therefore capturing the feel of the light on this stump in these conditions. If I look at this well here, again, an outlining with lines and a very quick and simplified series of lines to represent the stones of this old well. Again, a more considered approach of marks doesn't just define the stones, but it also reflects the light and the fact that these aren't lines drawn onto a smooth surface, which is what this really looks like. Could be tape applied to a smooth plastic cylinder. But rather, these are shadows being caught by the sun, and some of the shadows are deeper and therefore create more darkness that we've captured with our marks than we ever could have done with lines. In this drawing, where I've used sketch marker as well as hatching, I have some quite definite lines to indicate these columns, which are smooth, straight, hard edges. Now, they're not corners in the sense of they're not at right angles. We have the curvature disappearing around the edge. But I've used a solid, heavy, straight line because it works well here, particularly to make this building feel a lot closer than these buildings on the other side of the street. So while this edge is in sun and in other circumstances I may have used a light line, I've decided that a heavier line simply worked to separate this building and bring it closer from what could have been clutter behind. I varied the heaviness of my line so that the stronger elements stand out more clearly, and the, if you like, more background elements, such as the brickwork and the tiles, sit back a little bit. I've used very light lines, and I've tried to use marks that reflect the scale of the item. So I've tried to do, in a sense, these really little more than dots that indicate the vertical joins between bricks to be about the size that a brick height would be on this wall in relation to this building at this distance. And I've done the same with the terracotta roof tiles. And instead of just doing continuous lines to indicate the rows of tiles, I've tried to instead use marks that more capture the shadows that we see created by the mouldings, the corrugated mouldings of the tiles. And I've also used heavier marks and more detail for the ones closest. and reduced it as we go further away in either direction. Because in life, we will notice these lower, closest ones a little bit more than the others. We more get a sense that all the other tiles are there without actually focusing on them when we're looking at the subject. So I find marks to reflect that effect of life. With this big tree here, this frangipani tree, frangipanis have very large, very sculptural leaves. And so I've used marks to suggest the leaves in a lot of places. But I haven't gone overboard because, again, I don't want us to see nothing but leaves and a lot of ink because of the leaves, but particularly with this silhouette edge down here coming into a more prominent central position. But even up here, I've lessened this detail. I've had a little bit of the individual leaf detail here and down here, but just hatching and less detail down here, and no line ink detail in a lot of it, because I don't want a lot of ink detail here. That will draw the eye away from this wonderful columned portico balcony area, which is the star of the drawing. So I'm controlling my ink marks to draw attention to where I want the attention to be. Even this little flower box is drawn with heavier lines and marks than this shrub. Even though this shrub here is closer, this is, from a compositional point of view, more a focus of attention than this. We get to make all these choices, even though these sorts of distinctions aren't shown on our reference. As the artist, we get to choose them. This really old ramshackle wooden shed was something I just saw through a gap in the fence and took a photo of. There's all this wonderful foliage in contrast to the more geometric shapes of the old shed. But still, I didn't want to have a lot of smooth lines which would indicate a condition that the shed definitely didn't have. And yet I wanted a contrast between the planks, the weatherboards, and the foliage. This tree here used very different marks to indicate the outline of the foliage than I did for this tree. This tree being closer, I actually indicated a few marks that would show individual leaves. And I even did some in shadow and some in sunlight, which reflected the reality of the scene. But I very quickly pulled away from this sort of precision and became more generalized in my marks. Whereas these leaves down here, this very sort of spiky shrub, are very different silhouette, very different marks. This is mostly in shade. The sunlight really is only hitting this top edge that we see a bit here and here. Again, you'll notice along the top of this old corrugated roof, rather than using lines, I've really created the feeling of the corrugations by these blobs to represent the shadows, bearing in mind that these blobs are going to be larger and further apart, closer to us than at the other end. And something a little bit similar with this end. With this tree that was actually yesterday's video, I have a lot of hatching to capture the three-dimensional form of the tree canopy, but also pay attention to how I've defined the edging, the groupings of leaves. These ones around here are closer to us because these branches actually come towards us. So on a typical rounded tree shape, these leaves are closer than the leaves we see around the edge. And we also get a very different effect if light is hitting our tree from a certain direction strongly. If you like, the silhouette can be slightly less intense than on the darker side. And so I've controlled and manipulated my mark making to create a slightly heavier effect on this side by layering my marks on the edges to come across as slightly heavier, slightly darker than compared with where the sunlight is striking, where really a series of dots define some of the areas of foliage that we have. And obviously some of these marks are done with more intention and with more even pressure from the pen that creates a more solid, even line and a darker value more easily. And others I'm drawing them as lightly as I can. This was all drawn with the one pen, and learning to exploit pressure to get different effect from the one pen is a really important part of learning how to put ink marks on the paper to create different effects. Just imagine if I'd started this by drawing an outline, what a very different feeling it would have introduced to the finished drawing. In this drawing of the ruins of Whitby Abbey in England, again, control my marks to create a very definite, very distinct effect. And again, imagine if I'd started by outlining these shapes, these ruined sections that stand out very starkly against the blue sky in my reference photo. Because of the cloudless sky behind and because of the dark shadows of a summer's day, in fact, all of these edges are very clearly defined in the reference. And yet, and also I capture a sense of the battered nature of these ruins much more effectively by controlling my marks in a more interpretive way, by leaving bits unfinished, uncompleted, unjoined, by having dots to fill gaps and little curvy marks that almost go nowhere, but do create a feeling of raggedness, of destruction. And with my hatching, I've gone horizontally, which took a lot more time than going vertically, but it also lets me get nice ragged edges easily, and even where the hatching lines join, creates a sense of little divots and indents, little broken out bits of the stonework that create slightly darker shadows and slightly irregular edges. And then with my marks for the stones, while I don't indicate a huge number of stones, given that it's all stone, I do try and make sure that the scale of any individual stones I suggest fits the scale of the size of the stones that were used in the construction of Whitby Abbey when seen from this distance. And I'm very aware that this section here is significantly closer to me than this and this section, and that this is set back further. So while I drew this with the one pen, I'm going for a lighter effect across here, trying to make it feel further away. I've also been fairly restrained trying to maintain these areas of sunlight coming through from the other side that help us define the spaces of these beautiful windows of the main end wall of the Abbey. All of these shorter hatching lines also creates a feel of the columns of stone that we see here. So again, making choices about the direction of my marks, not just hatching for value, for the darkness, but actually considering what effect can my directions create of the underlying form, but also of the condition of the surface that I'm drawing. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this little journey looking at some of the marks I've used and why I've used them and some of the focus that I've tried to have helpful. Of course, each of these drawings has its own demo video where a lot of things are explained in detail. But when I talk about using marks rather than outlines, these are the sorts of considerations and outcomes that I have in mind. But in the end, however you draw, whatever you use, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.